Gravity doesn't negotiate. Steel doesn't care about your quarterly profit margins, and a frayed wire rope doesn't magically heal just because the boss is in a hurry. When you routinely hoist 80,000 pounds of cargo into the sky, the laws of physics are the only laws that matter. My cousin learned that the hard way. Before we get into the heavy lifting, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. Now, let me tell you how arrogance brought down an entire shipyard and how I ended up holding the deed. In the heavy rigging industry, there is a term we live and die by: working load limit, or WLL. It is the maximum safe force that a piece of lifting equipment can exert to lift, suspend, or lower a given mass without fear of breaking. It is not a suggestion. It is a mathematical boundary drawn between a routine day at the shipyard and a catastrophic industrial fatality. I've spent the better part of 2 decades respecting that boundary. At 44, as the lead safety and rigging inspector for Fisher Marine Terminal, my job was to look for the things that everyone else wanted to ignore. I looked for microfractures in spreader bars. I looked for rust fatigue in shackle pins. I spent my days coated in a fine layer of diesel exhaust, sea salt, and industrial grease, running my calipers over miles of braided steel wire. Mr. Fisher, the owner of the shipyard, didn't care about calipers. At 58, Fisher was a man who only saw spreadsheets, turnaround times, and the bottom line. Every minute a container ship sat at our docks, it cost him money. Every minute my inspections delayed a lift, I was bleeding him dry, as he loved to remind me. But for years, we had an understanding. I kept his yard from making the evening news, and he paid me a very handsome salary to do it. That delicate balance held perfectly until Fisher hired my cousin, Leo. Leo was 32, possessed a smile that could sell ice to a polar bear, and wore steel-toed boots that never seemed to get scuffed. We were cousins by blood, but we might as well have been from different planets. Where I was methodical, Leo was reckless. Where I saw risk, Leo saw a shortcut to a promotion. Fisher had hired him on as the new operations manager, utterly charmed by Leo's promises of increasing yard efficiency by 20%. Leo's grandest move upon taking the job was leasing a highly specialized, incredibly expensive piece of automated offloading machinery, a custom straddle carrier. It was a massive, pristine yellow machine designed to grab containers the second they touched the tarmac and whisk them away to the holding yard. Leo had convinced Fisher to lease it under Leo's newly formed LLC, effectively making my cousin a highly paid independent contractor operating within Fisher's yard. "It's the future, Mark," Leo had told me on his first day, leaning against the flawless yellow paint of his machine. "We're going to cycle these ships so fast, Fisher's head will spin. You just need to stop moving like a dinosaur and let us work." "I move at the speed of safety, Leo," I replied, wiping grease from my hands. "You cycle too fast, you miss things. And when you miss things in this yard, people don't go home to their families." Leo just rolled his eyes, adjusting his pristine hard hat. He didn't understand the forces we were playing with. He only understood how to look good to the boss. And to Mr. Fisher, Leo looked like a golden boy who was going to make him a millionaire twice over. I was just the old guard, the necessary evil, the guy standing in the way of progress with his clipboard and his red tags. They were about to find out exactly why those tags exist. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast and bitterly cold. The wind whipping off the harbor carried the sharp scent of ozone and impending rain. We had a massive Panamax-class cargo ship docked, stacked high with 40-ton shipping containers. I was up on the catwalk of the primary gantry crane 300 feet in the air, doing my pre-shift inspection of the main lifting assembly. The wind howled through the steel lattice, vibrating the grating beneath my boots. I was inspecting the main wire rope, a thick, braided steel cable as thick as my forearm, responsible for hoisting the equivalent of 10 full-grown elephants at a time. As I ran my gloved hand along the greased surface, a sharp prick pierced the thick leather. I stopped. Pulling out my flashlight, I illuminated a section of the cable about 10 feet above the spreader bar. My stomach tightened. It was a bird cage. In rigging terms, a bird cage happens when the wire rope is subjected to a sudden release of tension, causing the outer strands to bulge outward, permanently deforming the core. Worse, I could see 3 distinct outer wires had completely snapped, curling away from the main bundle like broken guitar strings. The structural integrity of the cable was entirely compromised. Its working load limit was now 0. I pulled my radio from my belt. "Miller, it's Mark. Do not power up the main gantry. We have a Category 1 defect on the primary hoist cable. I'm locking it out." "Copy that, Mark," came the gruff, static-laced voice of Old Man Miller, our veteran crane operator, from the cab above me, powering down the board. I pulled a heavy-duty bright red lockout tagout low-tube padlock from my harness. I snapped it through the main power relay box on the catwalk, pocketed the only key, and hung a laminated red tag on the controls. The tag read, "Do not operate. Lifting assembly condemn." By the time I climbed down the endless metal stairs to the tarmac, Mr. Fisher was already waiting for me, his face the color of a bruised plum. Leo was standing right beside him, holding his clipboard and looking deeply put out. "What is the meaning of this, Mark?" Fisher barked, pointing a trembling finger up at the dormant crane. "That ship is scheduled to be unloaded by nightfall. I have trucks lining up at the gate. The main hoist cable has birdcaged, Mr. Dunn." "Fisher," I said calmly, pulling out my inspection log and a pen. "3 outer strands are snapped. It cannot safely lift a load. If we put 40 tons on that cable, it will snap." "How long to replace it?" Fisher demanded. "I can have a specialized crew here by tomorrow morning." "It's a 24-hour delay." Fisher threw his hands up in the air, pacing a tight circle on the concrete. 24 hours? Do you have any idea what the penalties are for delaying that vessel? Thousands of dollars an hour. Thousands. Leo stepped forward, putting a calming, patronizing hand on Fisher's shoulder. "Mr. Fisher, let's not panic. Mark has a habit of overreacting. He sees a little wear and tear and thinks the sky is falling." Leo turned to me, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Come on, cousin. It's just a little fraying, right? It can handle one more shift. We'll swap it out tonight after the ship is clear." I stared at Leo, utterly disgusted by his ignorance. "It is not a little fraying, Leo. The core is compromised. The physics don't care about your schedule. If I say it doesn't lift, it doesn't lift." "You're killing me, Mark," Fisher hissed, stepping into my personal space. "I need this ship unloaded." "Then you'll need it unloaded tomorrow," I said, my voice flat, yielding no ground. I signed my inspection log with a heavy flourish, marked the crane as it failed, and handed a carbon copy to Fisher. "The lockout tag is on the relay. I have the key. Nobody touches that crane." I turned my back on them and walked toward the safety office to file the paperwork, leaving Fisher fuming and Leo staring daggers into my back. I was in my office, sipping a lukewarm coffee and filling out the daily digital compliance logs when the sound hit me. It was a low, powerful mechanical whine that rattled the window panes of my trailer. It was a sound I knew in my bones. It was the massive electric spooling motors of the primary gantry crane spinning up. I froze. I reached into my pocket. The steel key to the lockout padlock was still there, pressing against my leg. My chair hit the floor as I stood up. I shoved the door of the trailer open and sprinted out into the blinding afternoon daylight. I looked up. The massive spreader bar of the crane was descending toward the deck of the cargo ship. They were making a lift. I broke into a dead run across the tarmac, dodging forklifts and shouting at the deckhands to clear the drop zone. I reached the base of the crane just as I saw Leo climbing down from the secondary catwalk. He had a pair of heavy bolt cutters slung over his shoulder. When he reached the ground, I saw my bright red padlock snapped cleanly and half dangling loosely from his hand. He tossed it into a nearby oil drum with a loud clank. "What did you do?" I roared, my voice echoing off the corrugated steel of the warehouses. Leo didn't even flinch. He just gave me that slick, golden boy smile. "I solved the problem, Mark, like an operations manager is supposed to do." I went up, looked at the cable, and determined it was well within safe operational margins for one more shift. I authorized the lift. "You are not a certified rigging inspector," I shouted, pointing a finger at his chest. "You cut a safety lock. That is a federal violation. And you were costing us 50 grand in delay fees," Mr. Fisher's voice boomed. I turned to see him walking over from Leo's pristine yellow straddle carrier, which was parked directly beneath the crane's travel path, ready to catch the first container. Fisher looked smug, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just bypassed a critical safety measure. "Mr. Fisher," I said, my heart pounding against my ribs, "you need to radio Miller right now and abort this lift. That cable is going to fail." "Leo signed off on it as the secondary safety officer," Fisher said dismissively. "The paperwork is in order. We're moving cargo, Mark. Either get on board or pack up your desk." Leo stepped forward, holding out the final safety manifest on his clipboard. "Just sign the primary authorization, cousin. Let's make some money." I looked at the clipboard. I looked at Leo's arrogant face and then at Fisher's greedy, impatient glare. Finally, I looked up at the sky, where a 40-ton steel box was currently being hoisted out of the ship's hold by a cable I knew for a fact was dying. I pulled a thick black permanent marker from my vest pocket. I took the clipboard from Leo. Instead of signing my name, I drew a thick, dark line straight through the signature block, crossing it out entirely. I wrote 2 words in block letters across the top of the page, Glyph. I am not signing this, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo of the crossed-out manifest, and shoved the clipboard back into Leo's chest. I have my carbon copy from this morning. I have the photo of this. I have the key to the lock you just destroyed. I took 3 steps backward, creating physical distance between myself and them. When this comes down, I said, making direct eye contact with my boss, it's on you. I didn't argue anymore. Once a rigging lock is cut, the time for debate is over. We had crossed from a safety dispute into gross industrial negligence, and my only priority shifted from stopping the lift to mitigating the body count. I pulled my heavy 2-way radio from my chest harness and switched it from the command channel to the ground crew's encrypted frequency. All deckhands, all riggers. This is Butler, I said, my voice eerily calm over the static. Clear the drop zone. Clear the tarmac under gantry 1. Fall back behind the yellow safety lines. Do it now. Down on the concrete, the crew in their high-visibility vests paused. They looked at Mr. Mimprey, Fisher, who was waving them forward to guide the incoming load, and then they looked at me, standing 30 yards back with my arms crossed. They were seasoned men. They knew that when the safety inspector retreats and tells you to run, you don't ask questions. One by one, the riggers backed away, leaving the loading area completely empty. Fisher noticed. He keyed his own radio, his voice barking across the open channel. "What is everyone doing? Get back in position. We have trucks waiting." Nobody moved. The ground crew stood shoulder to shoulder behind the painted yellow line, watching the sky. I pulled my phone out and pressed record. I framed the shot perfectly. The massive gantry crane, the towering stack of containers on the ship, and directly beneath the crane's travel path, Leo's gleaming yellow straddle carrier. Leo was standing right beside his multi-million-dollar machine, his chest puffed out, pointing up at the descending spreader bar as if he were conducting a symphony. Fisher stood a few feet away, equally defiant. They were so proud of their efficiency. They were so confident that the rules didn't apply to them. "Miller," I whispered into my radio, knowing the old crane operator was trapped up in the cab, forced to follow the owner's direct orders. "God be with you, old man." I braced myself, holding the camera steady as the massive steel spreader bar finally made contact with the top of the 40-ton shipping container. The locking cones engaged with a heavy, metallic clunk that echoed across the quiet harbor. The deck was clear. The trap was set. All that was left was the physics. The electric motors of the gantry crane hummed, a deep, guttural vibration that you could feel in the soles of your boots. High up in the cab, Miller engaged the primary hoist. To the untrained eye, a heavy lift looks smooth, almost weightless, but a rigging inspector sees the invisible warfare happening within the equipment. I knew exactly what was happening inside that thick, braided wire rope holding the spreader bar. A standard hoist cable is made of hundreds of smaller steel wires twisted into strands, which are then twisted around an independent steel core. When a load is applied, those strands stretch and squeeze inward, gripping the core tighter. It is a masterpiece of engineering, designed to distribute 80,000 pounds of sheer vertical force evenly across every single fiber of metal. But our cable was bird-caged. 3 outer strands were broken. As the crane pulled upward and the massive blue shipping container lifted off the deck of the ship, that perfect distribution of force ceased to exist. Through the lens of my phone, I watched the steel ropes pull taut. The container cleared the ship's rail. It swung outward, suspended 200 feet in the air, moving slowly over the concrete tarmac, directly over Leo's flawless, custom-leased straddle carrier. 80,000 pounds. Inside the damaged cable, the physics were breaking down in agonizing slow motion. Without the 3 broken outer strands to hold the tension, the load transferred entirely to the central core, and the remaining, overstressed outer wires. The core was now bearing a weight it was never designed to hold alone. Ping. The sound was sharp, metallic, and distinctly high-pitched. It was barely audible over the wind in the engines, but to a rigger, it sounded like a gunshot. It was the sound of a single internal steel wire snapping under extreme tensile stress. Leo didn't hear it. He was too busy smiling, watching his prize cargo float toward him. Ping! Ping! 2 more wires gave way. The metal was heating up from the extreme, unnatural friction of the fibers tearing against one another. Up in the crane, the load must have shuddered, because the massive steel box suddenly dipped a fraction of an inch, swaying ominously in the coastal wind. I zoomed the camera in. I held my breath. Ping, ping, ping! A cascading failure had begun. The remaining outer strands were unwinding, shedding their structural integrity second by second. The sheer, crushing gravity of a 40-ton box of freight was violently asserting its dominance over a piece of compromised steel. The container was now positioned exactly dead center over the tarmac. Below it, Leo patted the side of his yellow machine, entirely oblivious that a guillotine hung by a thread directly above his head. Then the core gave out. It didn't just break, it detonated. The sound of a 3-inch braided steel main hoist cable failing under an 80,000-pound load is indescribable. It was a concussive, deafening crack, like a lightning strike hitting an anvil. The shockwave visibly displaced the air. High above, the massive wire rope parted. The sheer kinetic energy released by the snapping steel whipped the severed ends outward with enough force to slice a man in half. Gravity, absolute and merciless, took over. The 40-ton shipping container, suddenly freed from its tether, entered total freefall. For one agonizing, suspended second, the world seemed to freeze. I saw Leo's head snap upward at the sound of the explosion. I saw the triumphant smile vanish from his face, replaced instantly by raw, primal terror. He dove sideways onto the concrete. The container plummeted 200 feet straight down. It struck Leo's pristine, custom-leased straddle carrier with the force of a meteor. The impact shattered the concrete of the tarmac. A shockwave of dust, pulverized asphalt, and shrapnel blasted outward in a perfect ring. The deafening screech of crushing metal echoed across the bay as the heavy shipping container completely flattened the million-dollar piece of machinery beneath it. Folding its thick yellow steel beams like cheap tinfoil, the ground bucked under my feet. The air filled with the thick, suffocating smell of ruptured hydraulic lines, shattered electronics, and pulverized pavement. Then there was absolute, ringing silence. The dust cloud rolled outward like a tidal wave, a thick, choking mixture of pulverized asphalt, rust, and aerosolized hydraulic fluid. It washed over us, coating the yard in a suffocating gray film. For several seconds, the only sound in the entire shipyard was the chaotic metallic hiss of ruptured pressure lines and the faint swinging of the severed hoist cable high above. I lowered my phone. The video was safely saved to my local storage and immediately backed up to the cloud. I wiped the grit from my safety glasses and walked slowly toward the impact zone. The devastation was absolute. The 40-ton shipping container had struck dead center. Leo's pristine, custom-leased yellow straddle carrier, the machine that was supposed to revolutionize the yard and catapult his career, had been pancaked into a jagged, unrecognizable tangle of steel and shattered glass. The thick structural beams were bent outward like broken ribs. Pools of neon green hydraulic fluid and black engine oil bled out across the shattered concrete, mixing into a toxic sludge. Because I had cleared the deck, nobody was crushed beneath the rubble. There was no blood on the tarmac. The only casualty was pride, and a staggering amount of money. Leo was on his hands and knees about 20 feet away. He had lost his pristine hardette in his frantic dive for survival. He was covered in dust, staring blankly at the flattened wreckage of his multi-million-dollar investment. He looked like a man who had just watched his own funeral. A few yards to his left, Mr. Fisher was frozen in place. His face, previously flushed with anger and impatience, was now completely drained of color. His mouth hung open. He stared at the crushed container, then slowly looked up at the empty, swaying spreader bar hundreds of feet above. The reality of what he had commanded and what it had just cost him was finally breaking through his impenetrable wall of arrogance. The heavy silence of the yard was finally broken by the sound of the deckhands and riggers rushing forward from behind the safety line, their boots crunching on the debris. I didn't rush. I walked at an even, deliberate pace, my boots stepping carefully over jagged pieces of shrapnel until I was standing directly over my cousin. The shock wore off quickly, replaced entirely by the desperate instinct for self-preservation. As I stood over Leo, "Mr. Mine," Fisher suddenly snapped out of his trance. The color rushed back into his face, turning it a deep, dangerous purple. He marched toward me, his boots splashing carelessly through the pooling oil. "You!" Fisher screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "You were the head safety inspector. Why didn't you stop this? Why didn't you ground that crane?" Leo scrambled to his feet, seizing the lifeline Fisher had just thrown. "He authorized it," Leo stammered, coughing on the dust. "He was supposed to verify the cables. He told me it was safe for one more lift." I looked at the two of them. They were like drowning men trying to pull me under, completely blind to the fact that I was standing on dry land. The crew was gathering in a wide circle around us, watching the confrontation. "Is that your official stance?" I asked, my voice calm, projecting clearly across the quiet yard. "That I authorized a lift on a condemned wire rope?" "You signed off on it," Leo yelled, stepping toward me, trying to look intimidating despite the dust caking his face. "I have the paperwork. We all know you're sloppy, Mark. This is on your head." I slowly reached into my heavy canvas vest. I pulled out my clipboard. "This is the daily inspection log," I said, holding up the yellow carbon copy. Timestamped 0800 hours. It clearly notes a Category 1 defect, a bird-caged core, and 3 broken outer strands on gantry 1. It bears my signature, condemning the equipment. Mr. Min. Fisher, you were handed the original copy at 0815. Fisher swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the crew. That doesn't mean anything. You were supposed to physically secure the machinery." "I did," I replied. I walked over to the oil drum near the base of the crane. I reached inside and pulled out the 2 halves of the heavy-duty red low 2 padlock. I held them up for everyone to see. I locked out the primary relay. Someone took a pair of heavy bolt cutters and destroyed federal safety equipment to bypass my lock. A lock for which I hold the only key. Leo's face went bone white. You can't prove who cut that lock. It could have been anybody." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't play the video of the crash. I played the video of the crash. I played the video I had taken 5 minutes prior. The screen clearly showed Leo holding the bolt cutters, the broken lock in his hand, actively boasting about bypassing the safety protocols while Fisher nodded in agreement. I turned the volume all the way up. Leo's arrogant voice echoed out of the small speaker, sharp and damning in the silent yard. "I solved the problem, Mark, like an operations manager is supposed to do." Leo stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. Then I pulled out the final piece of paper. The lift manifest Leo had shoved into my chest. I held it up. Across the signature line, written in thick, undeniable black marker, was the heavy line I had drawn, accompanied by the words, "I'll lived." "I warned you," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard register. "I documented it. I locked it out. I refused to sign it. And then I cleared my men out of the drop zone so your hubris wouldn't cost them their lives." I turned away from them, looking out at the shocked faces of the riggers. "Nobody touches anything." This is now an active federal investigation scene. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the shipyard was swarming. Flashing amber and red lights reflected off the puddles of hydraulic fluid. The Port Authority had locked the front gates, and all operations were suspended indefinitely. Men in sharp suits and hard hats carrying digital tablets swarmed the wreckage. OSHA investigators, state environmental regulators, and most importantly, the commercial insurance adjusters. I sat comfortably on the tailgate of a company truck, drinking a fresh cup of coffee, watching the system do exactly what it was designed to do. Fisher and Leo were cornered near the harbor master's office by a lead insurance adjuster and 2 federal inspectors. From 50 yards away, I could see the frantic, wild gesturing of Mr. Fisher. I could see Leo wiping sweat from his forehead, talking rapidly, trying to spin a narrative of a rogue safety inspector who had failed to properly communicate the danger. They were desperate, but the trap had already closed. I had handed over my digital logs, the physical carbon copies, the broken lock, the crossed-out manifest, and the time-stamped video. My paper trail was a fortress of steel and ink. It was impenetrable, but the final nail in their coffin didn't come from me. It came from Old Man Miller. The veteran crane operator had climbed down from his cab, visibly shaken but entirely unharmed. When the investigators pulled him aside for his statement, Miller didn't hesitate. He was a union man, 3 years from a pension, and he had no loyalty to a boss who ordered him to lift a death trap. Miller sat with the inspectors and told them everything. He confirmed I had radioed at the defect and locked the board. He confirmed he watched Leo climb the catwalk with bolt cutters. Most damning of all, he confirmed that Fisher had directly ordered him over the radio to execute the lift despite the active warnings. I watched the lead insurance adjuster close his metal clipboard with a sharp snap. He looked at Mr. Dusser close his metal clipboard with a sharp snap. Fisher shook his head. In the heavy shipping industry, insurance policies are ironclad, but they carry strict clauses. An accident is covered. Gross, intentional negligence, specifically the deliberate bypassing of federal lockout tag safety protocols, instantly voids the policy. Fisher's multi-million-dollar liability coverage evaporated right there on the tarmac. Leo's situation was even worse. He had leased his custom straddle carrier under his own LLC, because he was the one who had physically cut the lock and caused the accident. Fisher's voided insurance wouldn't cover a dime of Leo's destroyed machinery. Leo was personally on the hook for a piece of equipment that was currently sitting in a puddle of its own fluids, flattened under 80,000 pounds of steel. The physical tension of the wire rope had snapped hours ago. But as I watched the inspectors walk away, leaving Fisher and Leo standing alone in the shadow of the broken crane, I knew the financial tension was just beginning to tear them apart. The destruction of a commercial shipyard doesn't happen in a single, explosive moment. Even if the catalyst does, the physical collapse takes seconds. The financial collapse takes months. It is a slow, agonizing bleed, measured in certified letters, court summons, and the steady, creeping creep of rust over dormant machinery. Following the incident, the federal and state agencies descended like vultures. OSHA issued a staggering array of citations against Fisher Marine Terminal for willful safety violations, totaling well over $2 million in immediate fines. The Environmental Protection Agency levied their own crushing penalties for the hundreds of gallons of toxic hydraulic fluid and diesel fuel that had seeped into the harbor's water table from Leo's crushed machine. But the government fines were just the opening salvo. The real damage came from the private sector. The shipping conglomerate that owned the 40-ton container sued Fisher for the total loss of their cargo and the subsequent delays. The owners of the vessel sued him for breach of contract because their ship had been trapped at our dock for 3 weeks while the Port Authority conducted their investigation. Mr. Fisher tried to fight. He hired expensive corporate defense attorneys, attempting to shield his personal assets behind the corporate veil of his company. But the evidence I had preserved, the time-stamped inspection logs, the video of the severed lock, the crossed-out manifest, was a silver bullet that pierced every legal defense his lawyers tried to mount. Gross negligence is the ultimate equalizer. When the insurance company formally denied his liability coverage, Fisher was left standing naked in a hurricane of litigation. Leo's demise was even swifter and far more absolute. Because Leo had leased his custom straddle carrier under his own newly formed LLC, he assumed he was shielded. He was wrong. The leasing company sued him for the total value of the destroyed machine, which hovered just north of $3 million. When Leo tried to file for corporate bankruptcy, the leasing company's lawyers successfully pierced his corporate veil, arguing that by personally cutting a safety lock and committing a federal crime, Leo was personally liable for the destruction of the asset. Within 6 months, Leo's golden boy persona had evaporated. He was fired by Fisher in a desperate screaming match in the main office that the remaining skeleton crew could hear through the walls. Leo's sports car was repossessed. His condo went into foreclosure. He was reduced to answering summons and dodging process servers, entirely bankrupted by his own arrogance. As for me, I had quietly resigned the day after the accident. With my impeccable safety record and decades of experience, I was immediately offered a senior consulting position for a massive logistics firm 2 states away. I didn't take it. Instead, I sat in my quiet kitchen every morning, drinking my coffee, watching the industry news, and waiting for gravity to finish its work on Mr. Fisher. It took 18 months for the bloodletting to conclude. The legal fees and settlements finally drained the last drop of capital from Fisher Marine Terminal. The bank called in the commercial mortgages on the property, and when Fisher couldn't pay, they seized the entire shipyard. Commercial foreclosure auctions are entirely devoid of emotion. They don't take place on the gritty, diesel-stained tarmac of the property being sold. They take place in sterile, heavily air-conditioned hotel conference rooms, populated by men in expensive suits holding numbered paddles. I was the only man in the room wearing a canvas work jacket and scuffed steel-toed boots. Over my 20 years as a high-level rigging inspector, I had lived frugally. I didn't buy flashy cars like my cousin. I didn't take expensive vacations. I banked my hazard pay, invested quietly, and built a flawless credit profile. When I saw the notice that the Fisher Yard was going to public auction, I took my financial portfolio to a private commercial lending group. I showed them the true valuation of the deepwater docks, the heavy equipment, and the storage facilities. I explained exactly why the yard had failed management, not location. They fronted me the capital I needed to back my own aggressive bid. When the auctioneer brought up the deed to the shipyard, the bidding started low. The property carried a stigma now. The heavy gantry crane was still damaged, and the cleanup costs deterred the casual investors. I sat in the back row, my paddle resting on my knee. A developer from out of state tried to pick it up for pennies on the dollar, likely intending to raise the docks and build luxury waterfront condos. I let him bid, watching his smug satisfaction. When the auctioneer called going twice, I finally raised my paddle. I outbid him by a margin just wide enough to signal that I was not going to yield. The developer glared at me, conferred with his associate, and raised his paddle again. I immediately countered, faster this time, my face a mask of absolute calm. We went back and forth 3 more times before the developer finally threw his pen down on the table in disgust and folded his arms. Sold, the auctioneer announced, pointing his gavel directly at me. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply stood up, walked to the clerk's table, and began signing the mountain of paperwork that transferred the 50-acre deep water terminal into my name. The morning air was sharp and tasted heavily of sea salt when I pulled my heavy-duty pickup truck up to the main gates of the shipyard. It had been nearly 2 years since I had stood on this asphalt. The yard was a ghost town. Weeds had begun to push their way through the cracks in the concrete. The massive blue shipping containers that used to form metal canyons were gone, sold off to liquidate Fisher's debts. A heavy steel chain and a thick brass padlock secured the main gate placed there by the bank's receivers. I stepped out of my truck. The wind howled through the lattice of the distant cranes, the same familiar, mournful sound I had listened to for 2 decades. I walked to the back of my truck, opened the toolbox, and pulled out a pair of heavy, 3-foot steel bolt cutters. I walked up to the gate. I clamped the forged steel jaws of the cutters around the bank's padlock, leaned my weight into the handles, and squeezed. With a sharp, satisfying crack, the lock surrendered. I pulled the heavy chain free, letting it crash to the concrete, and pushed the massive iron gates open. I drove my truck onto the property, the tires crunching over the grit. I wasn't here to do an inspection. I was here to take inventory of my empire. I parked near Gantry 1. The severed wire rope had been removed by the investigators long ago, but the massive crane still stood, waiting to be repaired and recertified. Directly beneath it, untouched for nearly 2 years, as the lawyers fought over liability, sat the crushed, rusting remains of Leo's yellow straddle carrier. It looked like a dead, mechanical insect pinned to the concrete by the ghost of an 80,000-pound shipping container. A heavy flatbed tow truck rumbled through the open gates behind me, its yellow strobes cutting through the morning fog. The driver backed up to the wreckage, stepped out, and walked over to me, handing me a salvage manifest. "You the new owner?" the driver asked, looking at the twisted yellow steel. "Hell of a mess here." "I am," I said, taking his pen. "Where do you want this junk hauled?" I signed my name on the authorization line with a heavy, deliberate flourish. It was the first signature I had put on a shipyard manifest since the day I crossed out my cousin's illegal lift. "The scrapyard," I replied, handing the clipboard back. "Sell it for the weight of the metal. Use the cash to buy the crew breakfast." I watched as the heavy winches hooked onto the crushed machinery, slowly dragging the rusting monument of Leo's arrogance and Fisher's greed onto the flatbed. It shrieked against the concrete, a final, dying mechanical protest, before it was strapped down and hauled away through the gates. I stood alone on the empty tarmac, looking up at the towering steel structure of the gantry crane. Tomorrow, the repair crews would arrive. The day after, the riggers and deckhands would return hired back at better wages, under stricter protocols and with the absolute guarantee that their lives mattered more than a spreadsheet. I pulled a fresh, heavy-duty low-to padlock from my pocket. It was bright red. I walked toward the power relay box on the crane to begin my work. The physics hadn't changed, but the management had. When you spend your life measuring the structural integrity of steel, you start to notice the structural integrity of people. Some men are built like solid forged iron. They can bear immense pressure, hold their ground, and keep the people around them safe. Other men are like a bird-caged wire, rope shiny on the outside, but structurally hollow, ready to snap the moment real tension is applied. My cousin and my former boss believed that authority and ambition could somehow override the fundamental laws of reality. They thought safety was just a bureaucratic obstacle in the way of their profits. But gravity is the ultimate auditor. It doesn't take bribes, it doesn't care about your job title, and it always collects its debts. I didn't have to seek revenge. I didn't have to scheme or plot or sabotage them in return. All I had to do was stand firmly behind the boundary of my own professional integrity and watch them destroy themselves. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone is rushing toward a cliff is simply refuse to be tied to them. Protect your peace, document your truth, and let the physics of their own bad decisions do the rest. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe.